Hi BookTube, it's Peg. I am back at the History Shelf. Today I have a book review for everybody. I've mentioned this book before. I've been reading it and I finished it a couple weeks ago, and I wrote a review for it at Open Letters Review, which I'll link below. But this is The Black Cabinet, The Untold Story of African Americans in Politics During the Age of Roosevelt by Jill Watts. Jill Watts is a professor of history at the University of California. Let me get that right here. California State University at San Marcos. Thank you. And she's written several other books. She's written a book on Hattie McDaniel. She's written a book on Mae West. She put 12 years of research into this book, and it really comes through. And what I really want to share with you guys today are some of my reactions to different parts of the book, especially the personalities, the people involved in the Black Cabinet. The Black Cabinet was an unofficial council of racial affairs advisors that were appointed to federal positions in different departments. It wasn't just one block. One council, overseeing racial affairs for the entire government. You would have African Americans appointed to the Department of Housing, or during the time of the Depression and the New Deal, which is what this focuses on, in Franklin Roosevelt's administration, people would work in the work projects, the WPA. They worked with the CCC, the Civil Conservation Corps, and other different areas as well as attaining. Sometimes they would be meeting with FDR to advise on African American concerns, needs, and seeking justice for just the plethora of injustices that were happening during this time in America. Now, it starts in, she gives a wonderful background, first of all, to what the Black Cabinet, how it kind of, the genesis of the Black Cabinet. And that is really one of the areas that intrigued me, was how in the beginning, because FDR obviously is a Democrat, there was a mass movement of African American voters from the Republican Party, which was known as the Party of Lincoln, obviously, in the late. Well, they were still primarily Republicans through the later Republican presidential administrations in the late 1800s, but around the turn of the century, and this is one of the themes of the book, especially when Jill Watts goes into the origin of the Black Cabinet, how people in Washington came together to informally discuss politics and how to advance the cause of social equality. And it starts with, the meetings that they would have at the Gray's Cafe in Washington. So the first section of the book it's a nice beginning, because it's part one of People in Politics. Okay, so it really kind of starts in 1908, and she talks about a group of folks. The Black Cabinet started at least twice. It started once in the early 1900s, and then it kind of ran into a barrier as far as people agreeing on the same issues and on the same goals. Not everyone was of a single mind within the Black Cabinet. Within any type of political or group, community organization, you're going to have people with different views on how to achieve goals. So there are egos involved, but it's just human nature. So the first Black Cabinet, when Booker T. Washington was involved with kind of making sure his Tuskegee Institute people were receiving federal appointments. That kind of died out around the time, I think, of the once the Depression hit. But really, the focus of the book picks up again with the wonderful personality in person of Mary Mcleod Bethune. So what was astounding about this book, well, and refreshing, I shouldn't say astounding, but refreshing, is that, as you can see from this photo, this was a picture taken in the 30s of the Black Cabinet. And at the center of that is Mary Mcleod Bethune. And she was basically the sun around which everyone orbited on this cabinet. She was a force and an inspiration. And she really held together a group of folks who had different takes on how to achieve equality within a government that was already prejudicial, excuse me, and discriminatory and racist at every turn. But she has a prominent place in this book, and in fact, I mean, I would love to see a full biography on her. She had an interesting upbringing. She was born in 1875. She was, her parents were former slaves. She was the 15th of 17 children, and early on she showed just a drive and ambition for education, for educating herself, for educating others. She, as a young woman, she eventually, she achieved her education and started up her own girls' school, which eventually turned into Bethune Cookman College and then later Bethune Cookman Institute. It was very well known at the time. And at the time of when the FDR came along, Eleanor Roosevelt was a very big advocate of education. And that's another part of this book, which was just really heartwarming, the friendship between Mary Mcleod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt. Because a lot of times Eleanor Roosevelt was the phone line straight into Franklin's office, because these two were tight, and she really believed in what Mary Mcleod Bethune was doing. But I'll get to that in a second. The thing about this book, what it really will show you, is the transition, I think, of the African American vote as it moved from staunchly Republican. I mean, obviously, after the Civil War and Lincoln was the great emancipator, African Americans voted Republican. At least the men did, because at the time women didn't have the vote. And so for a very long time, Republicans just assumed they had the African American vote in their pocket, and they didn't need to do anything. So they got very complacent. And it was a really frustrating part of this book for me reading it, was just, as Jill Watts recounts, how the leaders of the Black community would often reach out as elections were approaching for Republicans, saying, you do need our votes, and you're not really moving on these programs to, equal fair wages, non-discrimination in jobs, in hiring and all this kind of stuff. And the Republicans just would, they took it for granted that they're like, well, you'll never vote for the Democrats because that's the racist, white Southern party. But you know what? It's like they were all riddled with racism, Republicans and Democrats alike. So Jill Watts shows how a few of the folks that were like the prominent lawyers, journalists, educators, future judges, they all kind of banded together. Economists, there were prominent economists who had been Harvard educated. And let me just name some of these folks. They came together to say, you know what? Why not just take a chance on FDR? He at least he associates with the common man. He's not the big business guy. He says he's for the common man, and really the Republicans aren't doing anything for us, so why not just give it a try? What can we lose? And that's kind of how this all started to fall into place. And they helped, especially the journalists, and the African American press. That was another great part of this book. the research that Jill Watts did, she shows that the black community, especially in Washington D.C. and in the major cities, they all had their own newspapers, so that they would have their news covered, politics covered, just recounting what leaders in their community were doing in Washington and outside of it, trying to organize protests, ask for the rights that were theirs, and the African American press played a huge role in urging the mass electorate to move their votes, to give FDR a shot, essentially. And it was a depression, and the New Deal and what he was saying really appealed to most people because it was about helping the downtrodden. And at the time, the poorest of the poor were the African American, citizenry. So the people that were involved, that revolved around Mary Mcleod Bethune, were Robert Weaver. I have a little list here I can just run off here so that you can see who I'm talking about. And it was a mostly male cabinet, the unofficial council of racial affairs advisors. But she was the center. We had Robert Weaver, who was an economist, and he turned out to be the longest living member of the unofficial black cabinet. And he really hung on through just decades and decades of discrimination, racism. Just the fortitude of everyone that Jill Watts writes about in this book is just, it's incredibly humbling and inspiring to read. Just the stuff, the crap that people had to deal with day in and day out. It's and especially in a time like now, just to know the history and to go back this far, that wow, what an uphill climb it was and still is in many cases. So we have Robert Weaver, who eventually became the first African American to be appointed to the white cabinet, but an actual official presidential cabinet under President Lyndon B. Johnson as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Robert Vann, who was a prominent newspaper editor, and he was a key resource in the reporting that he did in his newspapers and what he did in the community to urge people to take a chance with the Democrats. William Hasty, and I'm sure a lot of you will know these names, also known as Bill as well. Bill Hasty. He was a lawyer and civil rights advocate, and he was the first African American governor of the Virgin Islands, and later on became a federal appellate judge. Now there were a ton more. There were many more, but these were like the most prominent. I'm just looking at my notes. These were the most prominent. Mary Mcleod Bethune, Robert Vann, Robert Weaver. You had Alfred Edgar Smith. You had a lot of fractious. Again, like I said, there were some rivalries within the black cabinet, as people would come in and out of the black cabinet as they took jobs or if they decided to leave them because they just were not getting anywhere, because these folks would go into their offices and they were in segregated lunchrooms. They couldn't eat in the federal, the Capitol building's lunchroom. They were just dealing with segregation still. They were dealing with rampant racism. In many ways, the book is very dispiriting in that sense, but it was the reality, and it's something we should know about. But they worked so hard, especially Mary Mcleod Bethune. Let me just read a quick. She gave a speech. She was a huge light in the African American community, just in her advocating for her race and for education and for social equality. And she was awarded a medal in 1935. And I was terribly moved by this. So this is part of her speech. Equality of opportunity is necessary to brotherhood, she told the crowd. We stand in adoration for those who, regardless of the section of the country in which they live, have been big enough, courageous enough to stand for social justice and equality of opportunity, even at the risk of their lives. But the key to achieving brotherhood was interracial cooperation. This is Jill Watts writing. So white Americans must clean out their, quote, dead branches of misunderstanding and lack of appreciation that have kept our existence clouded with prejudice, unquote. Brotherhood rested on human understanding, Bethune told the crowd. And then she advocated for that African Americans unite and put aside their differences. Because there was still a large group of African Americans, prominent African Americans who were Republicans and were still going to stump and campaign for their candidates, and kind of just looked down on the New Deal and did not trust the Democrat Party because they're like they're the party of lynchers, and they still have very bad memories of the Ku Klux Klan in the South, all Democrats. So there were a lot of differences. So, but she goes on to say here, yes. We must learn to work together, all of us, regardless of race, creed, or color. We must wipe out the feeling of intolerance whenever we find it, or belief that any other group can go ahead alone. We must go ahead together, or we go down together. And this is okay, I just read, that was Eleanor Roosevelt's quote. She was well, this goes hand in hand with what I wanted to quickly say about their friendship. She just loved Mary, and Mary really admired and loved Eleanor. They were very close friends, and Mary kind of schooled Eleanor on what it was like to be African American, and Eleanor was receptive. She's like, I didn't really, growing up, I never had these interactions. I didn't know, and she was appalled. So she would often attend these events where Mary was, and say a few words like she did here. And this first meeting in 1934. Or one of the events that she was at, they just a small act meant it was huge. In 1934, the First Lady, after saying those words, we must all work together, she rushed over to Mrs. Mary Mcleod Bethune with a gracious smile and hand extended in greeting. And then she shook hands with everyone on the platform. With that, Eleanor Roosevelt had broken one of racism's strictest codes, one that forbade even the most formal physical contact between whites and blacks. It affirmed in many people's minds that a friendship unique for its era had developed between the First Lady and America's most celebrated African American female leader. And that was Mary Mcleod Bethune. So, yes, Mary, this is the quote I really love, though. Mary asked the crowd, she asked those gathered if they had the fortitude and the bravery to join the struggle. It would not be easy. Quote, I would call tonight upon those who are star-led, who have clearly in mind a purpose in life, who do not fear the struggle and the work which must needs be the lot of those who dare to live above the cloud of popular thought and limited desire. End quote. And the crowd was electrified. She was just an amazing speaker. She had the power to really just move people and to energize them in what was a very long and exhausting struggle. So the book is, sorry I jumped around a little bit. This is a more informal feedback on the book. as I've written the review, but I just wanted to talk about these wonderful examples of inspiration, and just reminding you how strong people, African American people, had to be, and still have to be, and and though they were working with a limited portfolio, in a sense, they were given a limited, we're bringing you on to help us figure out the Depression with the New Deal, and how we can get out, get more jobs for African Americans and these types of things. They saw it as an opportunity to advise on and advocate for civil rights at every level. When World War II rolled around, which is also covered in this book, you see Bill Hasty, you see Robert Weaver, Robert Vann, all saying, desegregate. That didn't happen, not until Truman came around. But they used their positions for far more than it was, what they were allotted to do. But they saw a chance to really push civil rights forward. And so really, the men and women of the Black Cabinet, and mostly it was Mary Mcleod Bethune, but there were a few other women that were very instrumental as well. They laid the groundwork for future generations of civil rights warriors, both inside and outside the government. So I just can't say enough about this book. I think this is really incumbent upon all of us to learn about history that we just had no idea about. Like, sure, I read about books. I want to read about books, but I read about events that I've read about before, and I could read 3 different books on the battle of this or that. I could read 3 or 4 biographies on the same person. But it's really, I just love it when a book just kind of blows my assumptions or presumptions out of the water, and just pulls back the curtain on a time that I just had not a lot of insight into, and learned about some very, very strong moral, virtuous, at times fractious, but people with indomitable wills to fight for the advancement of their people, and for a race that had just been so oppressed and persecuted, and faced every day as they would go into work or go out into the country to collect data for for the FDR administration. They were facing very dangerous situations. People were being killed, and and lynched, and it's very sobering, but I think it's really necessary to take a look back just even further than present day. I know it's just speaking about this book at a time like right now, I think it's a time of great potential to maybe finally, get this right as far as civil rights and justice go. But it behooves us to know about the men and women in the early part of the 20th century who really suffered a lot to just put down a solid foundation that others could build on. I mean, she mentions how Martin Luther King Jr., he really looked up to Mary Mcleod Bethune. She was one of his his stars in the sky, as far as like guiding him on the continued path to fight for justice. So I just highly encourage you guys to check out The Black Cabinet. It is a great read. The writing is stellar. You will just fly through this book, but at the same time, you're going to want to take your time with it and really just let it absorb in the sacrifices these folks made to, to work within government for change, even though the government was just so dead set against it. One of the key things I want you to remember, though, and I earmarked this, and this is one of the great contributions that Jill Watts has made through this book is to, correct the historical record, in the sense that over time, the Black Cabinet became an accomplishment of FDR's, but that's not correct. That is not correct. So it says here, it's the very towards the end of the book here, that yeah, after the president died, after FDR died, a lot of people started rechristening they call the Black Cabinet the African American, the brain trust, because they were just the best and brightest and leading the way forward. But they called it Roosevelt's Black Cabinet, as if he had done it, as if he had put it together. And as it's like a sort of revisionist history, but as Jill Watts says, that is not the case. The refashioning of FDR's image, thanks in part to a few former black brain trusters, as well as members of the black press, overwrote the reality that the Black Cabinet had been born of the efforts of African Americans who battled a reluctant president, and he was, because he still had to cater to his Southern Democratic white racist base, who battled a reluctant president and an administration that was often explicitly hostile. Racial affairs advisors had been forced upon FDR by the African American community, while white liberal philanthropists and vote-hungry Democratic leaders. But the Black Cabinet was willed into existence by those very advisors who came together under Bethune and Weaver. The Black Cabinet existed because its members created and sustained it. It was never Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. And I underline that, because that's key to remember. This wasn't something that FDR did. This was sheerly an act of will and determination upon the leaders of the Black Cabinet, Bethune and Weaver, but also the others that worked within it and met regularly to keep tackling the issue of racism and discrimination and fighting for equal rights. So, The Black Cabinet by Jill Watts, Grove Press. Highly recommend, everybody. This was really good history, and it's necessary history. Today, more than ever, please check it out. Let me know what you think. If you read the book, I'd love to hear from you below in the comments. If you have any other recommendations, if you know some further reading on any of these folks, I would love to hear it. I'm probably going to do some of my own research on that. But until next time, A+. Love this book. Okay, BookTube, I will talk to you soon.